Hello everyone, this is Jotto, and welcome to the Managrind Tournament Recap. Bringing you the top decks, bringing you the top cards, and the state of the metagame for this week's tournament. Now, before we start, as usual, I have my little news thing. The three decks I was going to do as deck techs, kind of like I did on the weekly show. I'm going to do two of them in the end, because doing three in one video would make like an hour-long video probably. Not to mention the third deck, having looked at the actual tallies, the two decks that people really wanted to know about were much higher up than the last one. The last one was incidentally Paladin Giants. So yeah, that had the same amount of votes as a couple of other ones, and the reason I picked it was because there was one person who just said Paladin, so I thought, well, might as well do that one. But considering how much time it would actually take to do that kind of thing, I just decided in the end I was going to do the next most popular ones, which was Druid Beatdown and Warrior Legendaries. Not to mention, both of those decks were very relevant in this particular set of tournaments, and Giants Paladin kind of died off, weirdly enough. It's turned into more Healadin recently. I might do a video on that down the line. The other reason I'm doing it is because I am really busy this week. Yeah, this is why the tournament recap is coming out about 5 or 6 hours after it normally would, because I am pressed for time. I am pretty busy at school right now. I've got some other stuff going on, like the Undead Death Knight project with Moon, where we created a full set of cards for Death Knight, and we have to get around to recording some games on that on Cockatrice and uploading those and things like that. That's a project that's going to be released at some point. But I've got a lot of things going on right now, so need to cut down it on some of the extra stuff. But I might do a video on Healadin at some point down the road on its own, because I do think it's an interesting deck, and if it pops up in a tournament at some point, then I might do a weekly show on it. But anyway, without further ado, let's get started, shall we? Top 4 from the NA, we had Managrind Jackie, the MG tag being the Managrind NA team. There's lots of interesting players on the NA team, a lot of very good players. And Jackie, in particular, won all 3 tournaments for NA over the weekend. He won the Managrind Swiss tournament, he won the Top Deck tournament, and he also won the MLG Open tournament. So 3 tournament wins, the same deck, and it's a Shaman. That's going to be interesting to go over. But anyway, in second place, we had Willie Dills, which is an amazing name, and then tied for 3rd/4th, we had Era, and another Managrind team member, Reels. Now, onto Chaki's deck, which has sort of revolutionized some of the Shaman Midrange things, where Shaman Midrange was a deck I thought was going to come back at some point. I wasn't sure when or how, but I thought it would at some point, because it is quite a powerful archetype. The problem was getting an A-grade tournament player to play it and theorycraft it and get the archetype good, and 2, get over some of its bad matchups. Fortunately, the metagame sort of killed its bad matchups, being those burst decks, because it didn't have much self-sustain. But anyway, onto the actual deck. Now, Shaman Midrange is a deck which focuses around ending the game with big minions from turn 4 to 6 roughly, and playing a lot of removal for the early game with some draw power, maybe a weapon or 2, just focusing on controlling the early game, winning out mid game, and stopping the control and late game beatdown decks from taking over the game late. Now, let's start with the minions. We had the standard Bloodmage Thalnos. Bloodmage seems to make it into every single deck, and I think it's one of the best legendaries in the game. Played in almost every deck. It's not a massive power legendary, but it's super good to have around. Smooths out your draws a lot, helps a lot with the spell damage, things like that. And I forgot to close the window. Another obligatory thing that comes up in my videos. Anyway, so the next legendaries are Leroy Jenkins, Nat Pagel, and Tinkmaster. Now, Nat Pagel has showed up a lot more recently because of the nerf to Novice, so they need a draw engine. That's why that's there. It's very resilient early game, draws maybe 1 or 2 cards on average. Sometimes it draws 0, but then they have to spend a card to remove it. It's a solid card overall. Leroy Jenkins is a final destruction effect, you could call it. It's player removal. Because if you look at the spells, you have Rockbiter Weapons and Wind Fury, and you can combine these with Leroy to do upwards of 18 damage, or even 24, and if you burst it with some of the other spells, it's a lot of damage is the point. Big finisher, very good against these control decks that are trying to set up board position continuously and control your minions. You just play Leroy with Wind Fury and smash him in the face. Now, Tinkmaster is the third copy of Hex. Deals with things like Cairn, Ysera, Ragnaros. It's the third Hex. He has 3 total now. He deals pretty much anything large. Big Game Hunter deals with Ragnaros specifically. Pretty much just Ragnaros out of all the popular stuff. In tournaments, this would be cited out if people aren't playing Ragnaros, but Ragnaros is very popular. It doesn't kill anything else that's relevant, apart from Ragnaros in most situations. The rest of the deck, though, is fairly common for midrange. You've got Fire Elementals for board control and just beating down your opponent, Azure Drakes and Gadget Stand for a lot of draw, Unbound Elemental to benefit from all the overload, we have a Wind Speaker to benefit Leroy and some of the bigger stuff in the deck, and Flame Tongue Totems, which actually synergizes very well with Wind Fury and also your Hero Power Totems. Now onto the spells, we have Feral Spirits, which might as well be a minion card, but it summons 2 wolves. They deal with early game aggro very well, and against some of the slower decks they can be buffed up with Flame Tongue Totems to get in for 4 damage each. Very solid card overall. We have Lightning Storm, which is obligatory AoE, Earthshock, which is one of the best silences in the game because it flat out kills Twilight Drakes, it's very relevant. Lightning Bolt and Rockbiter function as the 4 copies of Lightning Bolt, so to speak, which is 3 damage for 1 mana. Lightning Bolt has Overload, which is sometimes a benefit with Unbound, and it can't be taunted and benefits from spell damage. Rockbiter is better with Wind Fury and also is better with the weapon, which is Stormforge Axe in this case. So they both have their upsides and downsides. It also hits things that Lightning Bolt can't, like Fairy Dragon. Now, Stormforge Axe is a very underestimated weapon, but ultimately it still does what it used to, which is kill 2 things and then probably deal 2 to the face. It's still a very powerful weapon. Do not underestimate that little axe. Now, onto Willy Dill's Warlock Aggro. Wait a second here. Warlock Aggro is supposed to be dead. No, it's not dead. As a lot of people have been saying, Warlock Aggro is not a dead archetype. It's just had to evolve, so to speak. Now, if we look at the actual list, first things first, the spells. The spells are a bit weird for Warlock Aggro deck people are used to. Shadow Bolt, that's weird, it slows you down a bit. Hellfire, interesting. Double Soulfire is pretty normal. No Power Overwhelmings, and a Siphon Soul. What's going on here? Now, what this deck is realizing is that it can go aggro, but it has to concede the fact that Druid Beatdown is a thing and Shields Up is a thing. You need to deal with these things. Shadow Bolt helps. Hellfire is sometimes direct damage and just deals with things like Wild Pyromancer and 2/4s with a 1/1 ping, things like that. Also helps a lot in the mirror match. Mortal Coil helps with Twilight Drakes if you silence it. For instance, like you can sideboard in silences and then Mortal Coil something. Now, Siphon Soul, I think, is the most critical spell in the entire deck here because it deals with things that the rest of the deck really has major issues dealing with. Primarily Ysera and massive taunts like Ancient of War, Druid of the Claw, even some of the smaller stuff like Sen'jin you might even Siphon Soul, although it's less likely considering you're running Dark Irons. But anyway, Siphon Soul is a very, very essential spell, especially if you're running an aggro deck against some of the really, really big stuff in the format. Now, onto the actual minions. Now, when I first started reading this deck list, I thought it was a mid-range control deck. Now, the reason for this was the first 4 minions. We have Lord Jaraxxus, Ragnaros, Sylvanas, and Black Knight. Sylvanas, less so, but the other 3 generally show up in control decks. Then I realized Lord Jaraxxus and Ragnaros are plan B, where if you can't finish your opponent, you just finish them out with really big stuff. Sylvanas is still very, very good against the bigger decks. Same with Black Knight, helps your tempo, you can life tap into smaller stuff, so you can play a small thing, life tap, you stay on par tempo-wise with your opponent. And The last two things here are Big Game Hunter, which deals with things like Ragnaros, as specified before, and Tinkmaster. Tinkmaster has been played in a lot of different decks, as I said in the last deck, because it's a pseudo hex. Now, in the case of Shaman, it's a third hex. But in the case of Warlock Aggro, they have Siphon Soul, but they don't have any way of dealing with Cairn, specifically. They don't have any way of dealing with Cairn, or other Death Rattle effects like Abomination, things like that. So Tinkmaster really does help with that kind of situation. Tinkmaster, it can't hurt you. If it's a 5-5, you can deal with a 5-5 better than you can a Ysera. I'll tell you that for instance. Now, the rest of the deck is pretty standard for the aggro-centric sort of playstyle. We have Knife Jugglers, Argent Commanders, Defender of Argus is obligatory, Abusive Sergeants, Argent Squires with all the buffs. Blood Imp still makes an appearance because it's still a Young Priestess effect. Young Priestess was still always good in these kinds of decks, and it dodges some of the single target removal and things like that. It's still a decent card in this kind of deck. Slightly slower, but you won't be getting as many minions, so the nerf is less relevant. Dark Iron Dwarf is still the Sen'jin killer, that's why it's here. Harvest Golem gives you some value, and Void Walkers, Loot Hoarder, Shatter just smooth out your early game quite a lot. Now, as I said, the interesting thing about this particular variant is the fact that it's slower than the previous ones, and the fact that it's still so good in this kind of anti-aggro metagame. Now, third deck is a Warrior Legendary Enrage deck from Era, where it's an Enrage base with a lot of key legendaries to really help it along. Now, the spells lead it to be sort of a control deck, with the exception of Whirlwind. Now, Whirlwind is very, very interesting against aggro decks, but aggro decks aren't played that much. Whirlwind, however, keys into some of the other mechanics that are in the minions. And the other controlling element is the Fiery War Axes, which deal with usually 2 minions or 6 damage to the face. Now, the minions, I'll finish with the legendaries. I'll start with the self-damaging engine sort of thing. But anyway, it's Frothing Berserker, Armorsmith, Acolyte of Pain, along with Cruel Taskmasters and Defenders in Whirlwind. So you just get as many attack boosts as is humanly possible and get a ton of armor off your Whirlwinds and your Defender buffs and things like that, and you just keep attacking, and you get some seriously large threats on the board. Arathi Weaponsmith is just value. Cruel Taskmaster can even be removal at times, and it is actually the reason why Inner Rage isn't in this deck, because it doesn't need the free Inner Rage. It can afford to spend 2 mana to get a 2/2 body along with it. Now, this particular engine is quite easy to stop, or it should be, but if you notice later on in the video, a lot of the slower decks have been dropping some of their removal. This is why that Warlock deck and also this particular Warrior deck managed to make it so far, because they've been getting greedy. They've been tuning for the mirror matches and some of the slower decks and not really focused on what they could lose to, being these aggro decks. Or in the case of this one, it's sort of a earlier game deck. Still playing a lot of the late game stuff like Sylvanas, Ysera, Ragnaros, even Grom and Cairn, really slow stuff, but it's playing some threats that can really get in a lot of early damage. Our Frothing Berserker, if not killed on sight, will do a lot of damage, and that is sometimes enough to win you the game. Now, as for the actual legendaries, it's running Fire Lord to just finish out your opponent. Ysera is an auto win condition if they can't deal with it. Sylvanas deals with anything large. Grom is also an auto win condition and a finisher. It's kind of a mix between Ysera and Ragnaros. It hits harder than Ragnaros. You can direct it, but it can be taunted, things like that. And the last one is Cairn. Now, Cairn is one of the reasons why Tinkmaster is so played. Cairn is so difficult to deal with if you don't have a Tinkmaster or a Silence. He just comes back in as a 4/5. Just so much health to get through, and the 4 attack kills pretty much anything that attacks into him. It's always a 2-for-1 or a 3-for-1, even a 4-for-1 at times. So you really need that Tinkmaster to deal with the Cairn. Now onto Reels' deck. This is a rogue Cantrip midrange deck. Now this deck, it's still playing the Cantrip core, so to speak, plus Nat Pagle, which is a card I sort of forgot to mention when I did the full breakdown of Cantrip Rogue. But saying Blood Mage, Loot Hoarders, Nat Pagle, and Azures. But this is more of a mid-range deck as opposed to the earlier faster tempo decks that we're used to seeing out of Cantrip. We still have Black Knight, Tinkmaster showing up, we have Argent Commanders, Defenders, things like that, SI7s. This is all pretty standard stuff. So I'm not going to go over that particular sort of section. What I'm going to go over is the fact that we have Argent Squire, which synergizes very well with Defender of Argus and is still very underestimated as a 1-drop. We also have Spiteful Smith, which is amazing with the double Blade Flurry. This deck is playing both Blade Flurries, no fan of knives, both Deadly Poisons, and a Spiteful. It's a very interesting engine that I did talk about on the weekly, but I'll just reiterate, it deals a lot of damage in AoE. I actually pulled this off a couple of days ago where I managed to Blade Flurry the board for 6 and attack him on the same turn. So 12 damage to the face and 6 to everything else on the board. That's a huge health swing and a huge board swing. Blade Flurry is very powerful with all these attack boosts. The other interesting techs in this deck are Ragnaros, which is not often played in these kinds of decks, but can finish out your opponent very, very quickly if left sort of on its own. And the other one's Ironbeak Cow. Now, Ironbeak Cow over Spellbreaker. It has less of a body on it. However, mages are less played. It only really dies to the Druid and Rogue hero powers. It's a buff target, and also it's a combo starter, which is fairly relevant for things like SI7 and Eviscerate. Having a cheap combo starter is incredibly relevant. It's one of the reasons why Argent Squire is also getting an extra boost in this kind of deck. Very interesting variant on the Cantrip deck. Bit of a slower one. Should expect to see this kind of thing come up a lot. Anyway, on to the top 4 from EU. We've got Caldi. Another comment. Caldi won the Swiss and the Open. We had a double win and a triple win in the same weekend, which was incredible to witness. We also had Trippy Worms in second. We had Xerox in 3rd/4th and Nature. Now, on to the first Druid beatdown deck. Yes. Now, if you look at the actual top 4, we had Druid beatdown, Warlock Shields up, and Warlock Shields up. It was a perfectly mirrored sort of finish, as usual. Now, before I make any comments, I've lost track of how many times Druid has won in a row in EU. I think we're up to like 5, 6. I don't know. It wins every single time. The decks don't change that much, to be honest, but it's won almost every single EU tournament on MLG in recent memory. Definitely outliving the month at this point. But anyway, moving on to the deck. Now, Caldi's deck is playing even less spells than normal. So bare bones on the spells. He's not even running a claw anymore. Prefers to run some extra legendaries and techs that he can fit into the deck because of the lack of spells, but he's just playing Innervate to get some bigger minions out first, Wrath to deal with small things, and Swipe to deal with big things. And that is it. Nothing else. Just 6 spells. Now, the fact that they can get away with a lot of these sort of cuts on spells really shows how powerful the deck is overall. Playing minions, a lot of the time, is more greedy, but more powerful. If you have to remove your opponent's stuff, you're losing out on tempo. So it's a big swing when a deck can afford to play so few spells and play a lot of minions while still retaining the controlling factor. Now, the reasons why this gets away with this is you have things like Blood Mage, which cycles. You have Cenarius, which is usually a 2-for-1. Nap Hagel, which draws through your deck. Sylvanas and Black Knight are always 2-for-1s in most situations. Tankmaster is sort of pseudo-naturalized. Ysera is always 3-4 cards for 1, and also draws you spells for removal. Now, those are the legendaries that were picked for this particular deck. It's missing Ragnaros, and that's deliberate. Now, the reason why this one's missing Ragnaros is because Big Game Hunter is in a lot of decks. So by cutting Ragnaros, it makes Big Game Hunter a dead draw for your opponent. Speaking of Big Game Hunter, running one in this deck as well. Now, I said that Big Game Hunter is essentially a Ragnaros sniper. It is. It doesn't hit that much else in the metagame, but Ragnaros is a big target and deals a lot of damage. And just having a 3-mana kill Ragnaros card that gives you a 4/2 is very relevant. The rest of the deck, we've got a Faceless to copy many of the legendaries, both played against it and also in the deck. We have 2 Ancient Allures to heal up and draw cards. Defenders, Keeper of Groves, Druid of Claws, these are all standard stuff. We have an Earthenring Farseer to heal yourself back up. Some Loot Hoarders for some cycling, and Acidic Swampoos, which is a very interesting addition, deals with some of the weapons from Warrior and Rogue, more specifically, and even a Jaraxxus weapon. Dealing with a Jaraxxus weapon is a very big deal. And lastly, we have the lowly Chillwind Yeti, which can be buffed, but just a plain 4/5 is very useful. But if it's buffed by a defender, that's quite terrifying. That's a 5/6 with taunt. Very difficult to deal with, dodges most removal in the game. Now on to Trippy Worms, who was also playing Druid Beat Down. Now I'm just going to go over the differences in the deck as opposed to the major outline of the deck, because I just went over it. Now, the spells, as we see from the previous version, it's running a few more spells. It's running Double Claw and a Starfall. Now, this gives you a few more options against aggro decks, especially. And it also gives you some more healing with the claws. However, it does clog up your hand every so often, so it gives you less consistency and power, which I think is probably why it ended up losing in the finals. Less consistency and power in favor of teching cards. So adding spells is probably better for ladder, but worse for single elimination tournaments. Now onto the actual legendaries. We still had things like Cenarius and that Pagel, but we had a Ragnaros in this one, giving the big game hunter a target, but also dealing a lot of damage. We had a Hogger. We have not seen Hogger in competitive play in months, but if you innovate a Hogger on turn 4, it can be good game at times, because it just deals 2/2s and wins the game on its own. But on top of that, I'm pretty sure the legendary lineup was the same. Apart from one thing, which I just noticed, which I did not see before, the fact that Cairn is being run in one of these but not in the other. Now, Cairn is, as I said earlier, one of the stronger legendaries in the game at the moment, because it's just sheer card advantage. Now, Kaldi not running it is a very interesting one, because Cairn is just one of the most powerful 6-drops. One of the reasons I can see why, though, is the fact that you lose a lot of tempo, and if you're that light on spells, you can't gain back tempo at all. Spells don't really give you tempo, but they also remove tempo from your opponent if you remove something they've built up on. And Cairn can't really do that. He's not really an instant one like the Black Knight, for example. And that is the small disadvantage that card actually has, which is probably why it wasn't in the first place deck. Now onto the rest of the deck, we had one less Ancient of Lore. We had the same Big Game Hunter, Keeper of the Grove, Druid of the Claw line. We didn't have Defender of Arguses, because the deck doesn't tend to need it as much. We had a Fairy Dragon tech to deal with some of the control decks. And we had 2 Chillwind Yetis. Double the Yeti. Half the Defender, or no the Defender actually. But as I said, Chillwind Yeti is a very interesting card to put in this kind of thing. It's nicknamed the Value Yeti by a couple of people, the Dorox Yeti, depending on which player you went to first. But Chillwind Yeti is very interesting, not running the buffs in this situation, so it's less powerful, but still quite an interesting card. If you innovate it out, it's pretty much good game. Now, onto the Warlock Shields up section. Now, this one is very interesting. Why is it very interesting? Look at the deck. There's no legendaries in it. That's the first time there hasn't been legendaries in a deck that's made top 4 in months. It's been so long since we haven't seen a legendary in a deck. This is budget Warlock Shields up. Take notes if you don't have that large of a budget to go off. It's very bare bones. Pretty much a skeleton list almost. We've got the Shields up engine at the top, making the top 12 cards of the minions. Then we have Earthen Ring Farseers to heal yourself back off of life taps. 2 Iron Beacons to silence. 2 Spellbreakers, running 4 silencers in this case. But that's it. It's classic Shields up. Minus the Spellbreakers, every single card in the minion section is part of the skeleton list. That's just run in every single version. Spellbreakers are the tech in this case, and also the second Twilight Drake. But onto the actual spells, we have Double Soulfire, because he doesn't have any big legendaries to discard in this case, apart from maybe a couple giants. Drain Life helps deal with some of the earlier aggro decks a bit better, because you gain some life back. Double Hellfire, and 1 Shadow Flame, running the 3 AoEs instead of the 4. And the cut on the Shadow Flame was for an extra Twilight Drake, so it's a very interesting cut on that, because Shadow Flame is better with larger stuff. So if you add a Twilight Drake in, Twilight Drake's not an amazing Shadow Flame target, so they're kind of interchangeable, but they both deal with aggro quite well, because Twilight Drake has amazing trade potential. But besides that, it's just a skeleton. Like, if you want my full opinions on this kind of deck, go to the last weekly show when I talked about Warlock Shields Up, because this is an exact skeleton list. It's very interesting to see the bare bones Warlock Shields Up deck make it to the semifinals. I'm intrigued. I really am intrigued. Now, onto Nature's version of the deck. This is the more sort of teched out version, running a few less spells, more fancy when it comes to the actual legendaries and things like that. This is the thing that everyone's used to. We have the Shields Up engine as usual. We've got double Twilight Drake again. We've got the first 12 cards, and we have the Harvest Golems and the Earthring Farseers. Random comment, by the way, there weren't any Harvest Golems in this Shields Up deck, which is very interesting. Harvest Golem is generally sort of meant to be a guaranteed 2-of in these kind of decks. But yeah, we have the full sort of skeleton thing, and the spells are fairly normal, apart from the Soulfire. One Soulfire is missing from the spells, because he didn't feel like he wanted to discard a lot of his stuff, because a lot of his stuff is one-offs in terms of the legendaries and also a Hellfire. Really don't want to discard that stuff. If you discard a one-off, it's really, really bad. So no Soulfire in this deck. Now onto the actual legendaries, we have Tinkmaster, along with 2 Siphon Souls, deals with a lot of stuff that you just don't want to deal with in any way. Black Knight deals with some really big taunts. Sylvanas, Lord Jaraxxus, and Leroy Jenkins. Leroy uses a bit of a help to finishing, and Lord Jaraxxus is a win condition. The rest of the legendaries are very sort of tech orientated, with Sylvanas just being solid overall. Now it's very interesting to see 2 different variations of both Druid Beatdown and Warlock Shields Up, one of them being budget and the other one being a full one. In the case of Druids, we have a more greedy version with less spells, and a less powerful version but more sort of consistent and teched out against various different matchups. The EU is very stable in terms of metagame. The NA is still changing. There's still a lot of metagame shifts going on in the NA, but the EU is quite stable when it comes to metagames. So anyway, as for the actual metagame, now, we still have Druid sort of dominating, at least in EU. We've got Druid and Warlock dominating in EU, but on NA, we have some very interesting things going on. We had a Warrior come up, Rogue Cantrip is still coming back in various different ways. We had a Shaman appear for the first time in ages and win 3 tournaments in a row. It was a very, very interesting setup. We even had a Warlock Aggro deck in this particular top 4. The top 4 was very diverse for the NA. Shows that there's a lot of fluctuations going on in the deck testing in NA, and you never know, some stuff might come up. The metagames on both sides are similar but not the same. Some of the decks show up on both sides, but they're more prevalent in EU as opposed to on NA. A lot more Brewers on NA, I've noticed. So a lot of interesting decks do come out of NA. They don't always work on both regions, but it is a very interesting metagame to be part of. The EU metagame is fully stabilized at this point and is all about refining the deck as opposed to innovating. That was a bad pun. Whatever. Anyway, it's all about refining the decks. As we saw in the 2 Druid decks, the differences were very slim, but it was just enough to give Kaldi the win in the mirror match. So the changes were very, very slim, but they do matter a little bit, and also something else that's created by this kind of metagame that's locked is more focus on player skill as opposed to deck building skill. They're both a form of skill that are involved with the actual player, but one of them's to do with piloting and the other one's to do with actual deck building. The NA seems to be a bit more focused on deck building at the moment, whereas EU seems to be focused on just playing perfectly, and that's how you win. It's a very interesting setup we got that will probably fluctuate within the next couple of weeks, but I do want to see where this is going. Anyway, as for now, this has been Jotto. If you like the content, please subscribe. If you have any feedback, put it in the comment section below. If you want to come and chat at some point or talk to any of the Managrind team members, come on to managrind.com on Teamspeak. Anyway, this has been Jotto, signing off.